We started this project probably about a year ago through technical assistance through the National Governors Association. What we recognized was there was an opportunity to make some pretty significant changes relative to the impacts of the pandemic that children and families were experiencing. One of the things I think that we recognized is that several things were happening as we went through that process. With the shift to a virtual learning platform, a couple of things happened. So the first thing, students weren't in classrooms. So with students not being in classrooms, that limited the ability of educators to be able to identify signs of abuse and neglect and provide that level of support that was needed. What was also happening during that time is that families were struggling to access resources for their children and for their own families. So our goal was to enhance both sides of that, to help educators realize how they can identify signs of abuse and neglect in a virtual platform, and then to help families realize what is available to help them with the myriad of problems that were created through the pandemic. Some of those problems, they existed before the pandemic. Food insecurity, housing issues, struggles around getting mental health services for students. But the pandemic really elevated those concerns. So we wanted to find a way to strengthen the health and well-being of families while ensuring that children were safe.
Through that, we came up with an idea around creating a resource application for students. From the premise that if students weren't able, and families weren't able to come into school and talk to their guidance counselors or their teachers who normally give them those supports, that we could put it in their hands, right? We know that every kid generally has a phone or some sort of device, particularly in the pandemic, because schools were providing that for them. So if we could make those resources and tools available on those devices, that would increase the amount of supports that students and children were able to receive. We know if you're a 12-year-old student or a 10-year-old student and there are challenges happening in your home, you don't know who to talk to if you don't have a teacher or a trusted adult that you can go and speak to. I myself am a former middle school teacher, and so I know particularly at that age, if you're not talking to kids and developing those relationships, they're not gonna freely tell you that kind of information. And so, but they might look on an app and say, like, I wonder what happens if I text this number, or I wonder what happens if here's this resource about food and I see that my fridge is empty more often than it used to be. So maybe I should show this resource to my parent and see if it can help.
So as we worked through the project, we had to be flexible in where we started and where we ended up. And pivoting was key for us. So sometimes an idea of where we started and where we ended were a little bit different, but that really led us down into figuring out what was best for what's going to be best for our communities. We figured out it was best to create a resource hub linking all the resources that we have throughout the state for families to access at just one click of the button. So, like I said, what we found over time is there's so many great things out there. We just needed to give a centralized place for that. Throughout the process, it was great to have the support of the NGA work group and the leaders to, get us back on track if we thought we were veering off in a certain direction. It was super helpful to have, those resources and the groups to hear what some of the things that they are doing in their states to help us guide our work.
Lessons learned with all the collaborators on the National Governors Alliance, which comprised of really the multidisciplinary team that responds to the needs of children and the needs of educators, was first of all how dynamic educators and school employees abroad, school counselors, school psychologists, paras, and the school nurses, as well as teachers, how they literally had to flip a switch within a day or two and continue with the education of our children. So for that, we are most grateful. What we learned was that the rest of us who serve on the multidisciplinary teams was that we could do a better job in providing them with the supports they need to protect the safety and well-being of children, with a particular focus on abuse prevention. We believe at the Bo Biden Foundation that abuse of children, as well as bullying and neglect, is something that can be very preventable. if we provide them with the tools on how to recognize, respond, and report to it. And even beyond that, to move towards primary prevention strategies to prevent children from being in those situations in the first place. So we spend the large majority of our time training, policy writing in collaboration with folks who serve children and their families to establish a response for suspicions of abuse or neglect, also to provide student programming for bullying and cyberbullying, and then also to help them have the resources to provide families with in these situations.
I think the best part of the collaborative effort was being able to have a seat at the table from an instructional technology perspective. Having students learn remotely was a challenge over the past 18 months, and trying to get kids to install an app or to have access to a tool, it presented its challenges. So what we thought of from our perspective, and having that perspective of working with kids in that digital environment, was to try to find things that already existed and build a bridge to them from their digital school environment. So typically with any sort of issues that would arise that a student might be experiencing potential for domestic abuse or an unsafe home environment or relationship issues, they would have their teachers to go to, but they might not have had that access due to a myriad of reasons through the pandemic. So by putting the access and that bridge to those resources in their digital school environment through their learning management system, for us was a way to ensure that all students would have access to those, and they wouldn't have to have access to an additional device or an additional connection or an additional service.